Okay, today what I'm going to present is a joint work made by myself, by Antonio, and by Leonardo Ceragioli. And we will discuss two different strands in Proof-Theoretic Semantics. As you know, the term Proof-Theoretic Semantics was coined in 1991 by Friedrich, and since then many diverse ideas and developments have been said to pertain to this research field. In our work, we will focus on Proof-Theoretic Semantics as it is currently conceived, and we try to provide an overview of the most relevant steps and achievements in the development of two distinct strands. We will call these two strands from semantics to rules and from rules to semantics approach. We do not pretend that these two approaches amount to the full PTS field, nor that these two approaches are completely kept apart from each other. However, it seems to us that these two perspectives are not often and not clearly distinguished, and that these conflicts may lead to confusion on what Proof-Theoretic Semantics is and on what it should be expected to do. Besides focusing on the differences, we will try to highlight some similarities between these two approaches. As it is generally recognized, one of the principles at the ground of Proof-Theoretic Semantics in general is the Gentzen principle, Gentzen tenet that logical meaning is determined by introduction rules in natural deduction, while the elimination rules can be seen somehow to be consequences of this semantic determination. However, some of the differences between the two approaches we are distinguishing stem from how the Gentzenian principle is understood, from the role it plays in the overall theory, and from the purposes it takes to serve. Just the first characterization of the two approaches can be given by saying that the from semantic to rules approach, from now on as R, subsumes Gentzen principle to a notion of global validity of proof structures, while from rules to semantics approach, from now on RS, takes Gentzen principle literally, focusing on the criteria such rule must satisfy. Before presenting in detail, or before going in a survey of these two approaches, we think that it's worth considering how both approaches find their common ground in many of the relevant notions arising from Michael Dummett's analysis of deduction and meaning. So, as we know, Dummett's inquiry on meaning operates on two distinct levels. That is, however, deeply interrelated among each other. The level of theory of meaning, the inquiry into the general principles and form a systematic study of language should adopt, and the level of meaning theory, so the construction of a systematic theory, semantic for a given language. These two levels are deeply interrelated, as I said, and in some sense, the inquiry into general principle that leads the construction of the semantic system is motivated within a global philosophical analysis of the functioning of language. For what interests us, the true notion that is crucial is the composition and natural meaning that Michael Dummett points out as a way of prevent from holism, and the harmonious character of language. So that it means the balance between the grounds for asserting a sentence and the consequences we draw from accepting it. And we'll come back to this point later. These two interrelated levels find, we can say, a privileged place in the logical basis of metaphysics, where Michael Dummett tried to provide a proof-theoretic justification of logical law. The justification Dummett seeks is a truly proof-theoretic procedure, in his idea not contaminated by any idea related to proof theory. And it's worth pointing out that in pursuing such goal, two general aims follow. First, the construction of such justification allows the development of a semantic theory, that is a meaning theory, for the framework of language where logical constants are introduced, and so provide a test for the overall acceptability of the semantic system. Second, these procedures provide a semantic explanation, in the light of the meaning theory we are adopting, of what makes deductive inference possible, and of how logical constants of how the rational practice of deduction is coherent with the other features of our linguistic practice. To provide a justification, we must assume, to provide such type of justification, we must assume a set of logical rules that are, in a sense, self-justifying. It means that these rules do not need any type of justification, and we recognize their validity from the outset in a sort of intuitive way. However, the question is then, what does it mean for a rule, for a set of logical rules, to be considered as self-justifying? The overall answer to the question concerns the meaning, constitutive nature of such rules. So the idea is that we are entitled to accept a set of rules as holding without the need of further justification, because by stipulating them, we are fixing the meaning of the logical constant they govern. So we have, however, to reach this goal, to provide some constraints that the set of rules must satisfy. The first constraint is what Dummett called uniqueness. The idea is that a set of logical rules for an arbitrary constant is unique if and only if, for any new constant, we can derive from L and from L star, so the set obtained by substituting by replacing the first arbitrary constant with the second arbitrary constant, the equivalence between A first arbitrary constant B and A second arbitrary constant B. The rationale of such condition is the idea that we are entitled to stipulate a set of logical laws as self-justifying only if, by doing so, the rules fix the meaning of the logical constant they govern. Take, for instance, the case in which L does not guarantee uniqueness, and the two constants would obey to the same logical rules, but they will not be equivalent, and so they might bear different meaning. The second constraint to the set of rules that, for Dummett, the rules must satisfy is harmony. We will come back in a while to the conception of harmony Dummett presents in the logical basis of metaphysics, because it's a little bit more tricky than you can see now on the slide. The general idea is that, following Belknap, harmony is defined as conservative extension. So, an expression is harmonious if its addition to the rest of the language results in a conservative extension of the language. This means that the new language with expression proves no new statements in the old languages without the expression that couldn't be proved before. In line with Gentzen and Dummett, so the idea that the introduction rules are the rules that are meaning conferring, Dummett then adds another constraint that it calls from the complexity condition. This principle requires that in any application of a rule, the conclusion must be of higher logical complexity than any of the premises and than any of the discharging assumptions. As you can see, the complexity condition is a direct emanation of the principle of compositionality. So we come back to the idea that we present at the beginning. Just one point to point out. Even though Dummett seeks for a quite general formulation of the proof-theoretic procedure with respect to arbitrary logical constant, as well as with respect to different semantic systems, for instance, a pragmatic theory of meaning, so a theory that takes the elimination rule as meaning conferring, we do not have a clear understanding of this principle, for instance, of a pragmatist theory of meaning theory. In the logical basis, he sketches a sort of analogous of the complexity principle for elimination rule, but neither Dummett nor many of the approaches in PTS have developed this type of suggestion. Okay, now come back to the concept of harmony. So we say that in the logical basis of metaphysics, Dummett distinguished two types of harmony. The first one is what he calls total harmony or harmony in common. And you can see this, it amounts to the notion of conservative extension. So the idea is that the addition of a logical constant produces a conservative extension of the logical theory to which it is added. However, based on the idea of harmony as conservative extension, Dummett introduces another notion of harmony. And this another is quite problematic, but we can perhaps discuss later. The idea of intrinsic harmony that pertains only to logical rules for a specific logical constants. The idea is that intrinsic harmony pertains just to rules governing logical constants, and it amounts to the leveling of local bits. So the idea is that the introduction and elimination rule for an arbitrary logical context obtains if and only if there is a deductive path from the premises of the introduction rule to the conclusion of the elimination rule without invoking the rules governing the constant. The result of such notion is that any elimination rules shown to be in harmony, but in intrinsic harmony with the introduction rules are justifiable and then are valid. We can see that while intrinsic harmony pertains just to set of rules for specific logical constants, total harmony has a more relative flavor. It depends on the type of logical theory we are adopting. So we can, just to summarize, see, this is just a brief summary of the role that the concept of harmony plays in Dummett's philosophy of language, and specifically in his investigation of meaning. For Dummett, harmony indeed guarantees the possibility of critique and revision of the use of language. And these hold for natural language and for formal language as well. The second point, harmony guarantees the principle of the innocence of logic, as Sternberger puts it. What is the idea? The idea is that it's not possible only through deduction discovering unknown truths that we would have been incapable of discovering independently of logic. The third point, harmony guarantees the grounds for the construction of a meaning theory based on inferentialist considerations. And this will be one of the crucial points of the second approach I will present in a while. The fourth point is that harmony guarantees the grounds for the criticism to classical logic. And this is the goal that Michael Dummett said, six at the end of the logical basis of metaphysics. Last point, harmony guarantees or assumes the role of a criterion for logicality. So through harmony, we are able to distinguish the logical part from the non-logical part of a language. But come back to Dummett's proof-theoretic justification of logical law. And we can say that the general strategy consists of showing that we can dispense the rule we are trying to justify if we have a valid argument of the premises of an application of the rule, that we already have a valid argument not appealing to the rule for the same conclusion. In advancing this procedure, Dummett explicitly refers to Proudhon's work. I will left aside many of the technical details of the definition of Michael Dummett. But just say that Dummett considers argument as arranged in natural deduction fashion. First, define a notion of canonical argument. These are the four criteria that we can apply to see what is a canonical argument. And a canonical argument is defined with respect to a set of atomic formulas, atomic base, for which he assumes a set of inference rules. He calls them boundary rules, that whose validity is immediately recognizable and which allow us to derive atomic formulas from one to or more other atomic formulas. Then, once introduced the concept of supplementation of argument, a sort of procedure for manipulating arbitrary argument, and the concept of critical subargument, is able to define that an arbitrary argument is valid if and only if we can transform any supplementation of it into a valid canonical argument with same conclusion and premises, and a canonical argument is valid if and only if every critical subargument it contains is valid. We will see some similarities with one of the other approach, with one of the two approaches we are going to distinguish. Another point that lies between logic and semantics concerns the fundamental assumption. Dummett explicitly states that to guarantee the effectiveness of the justification procedure and of the model of meaning displayed by the semantics we are using, we must assume what he calls the fundamental assumption. Since the set of introduction rules fix the meaning by determining the canonical means to establish a sentence as true, Dummett recognizes that we must assume that whenever we are entitled to assert the statement also by indirect means, is by non-canonical means, we could have arrived at our entitlement to do so only by the canonical means. The relationship between canonical and non-canonical means establishing the truth of a statement pertain, once again, to the language as a whole, not just to formal languages. And with respect to the domain of logic, this assumption means that whenever we are entitled to assert a complex statement, we could have arrived at it by means of an argument terminating with at least one of the introduction rules governing its principal operator. Moreover, the fundamental assumption guarantees also to the semantic theory the satisfaction of the molecular requirement. So the imposition of an order to the language that, in accordance with the principle of compositionality, once again, lead our speaker understanding and guarantees that given an argument for arbitrary sentence, there is always an argument for it that proceeds in accordance to the way in which the statement we are examining is composed from its subsequential expressions. Why this fundamental assumption is in the boundary between semantic and logical level. On the one hand, from a logical perspective, the holding of the assumption guarantees the self-justifying character of the set of introduction rules. Because if the assumption doesn't hold, then the introduction rules cannot together exhaust the canonical means of establishing a statement with the logical constant in question as principal operator, and so cannot suffice to determine its meaning. From a semantic perspective, to interpret the modality, the critical modality could have occurring in the assumption, we must at the end invoke some notion of truth, an issue that not pertain to logic, but to the level of theory of meaning. Why? Because different meaning theory, for instance, a truth conditional meaning theory, so from a realist perspective, and an inferentialistic or verificationist meaning theory, so Dummett, meaning theory from an anti-realistic perspective, would interpret in a different way the modality and so the meaning of the fundamental assumption. Just a remark before going and deepen the two approaches that we will consider. So we can say that that the meaning of a statement determined by the introduction rule prevent from the conventional from a set in arguments. If we have a set of rules that are harmonious, then we can prevent from strong disharmony. So the idea that the elimination rules are unduly permissive with respect to the corresponding introduction rules. So if our elimination rules are harmonious with respect to the introduction rule, we are able to derive all the consequences connected to the introduction rule. However, the harmony does not show that we are able to fully exploit the meaning. It means that we draw all those consequences we should be entitled to draw. So harmony, as we have defined it so far, does not prevent the weak disharmony. A type of disharmony set of rules, for instance, for Dummett is the elimination rule for quantum disjunction. So the demand of this perfect equilibrium between grounds for asserting a true statement and consequences drawn by accepting the statement can be met by adding what Dummett called the requirement of stability. But to attain such goal, we should take into account two justification procedures. The upward justification procedure, which assumes as self-justifying and as meaning-giving the logical constant, as giving the meaning of logical constant, the set of introduction rules that validates a set of putative elimination rules. On the contrary, the downward procedure assumes the set of elimination rules as self-justifying and as meaning-giving, and then validate a set of putative introduction rules.
In both cases, harmony is guaranteed between valid rules. As we hope will be clarified soon, aspects which will be later picked up separately by the SR and RS approaches in Dummett's philosophy appears somehow harmoniously articulated. For instance, the notion of validity put forward in his proof-theoretic justification is close to the spirit of the SR approach, while the semantic character of the proof-theoretic balance with logical rules is close to the RS approach. So we can skip to the first approach. From Semantic To Rules tradition, Gentzen tenet is not understood locally as a criterion for the validity of a given elimination rule, but it is understood globally as a criterion which arbitrary non-introduction inferences must cope with in the context of a broader notion of valid proof structure. So the notion of valid proof structure is defined in turn by generalizing notion and results drawn from Pravit's normalization theory for natural deduction. Particularly, the validity of proof structure is equated to the reducibility of the letter to some semantic privileged form, via the kind of reduction used in standard normalization procedures. But let's start by defining a proof structure. A proof structure is a finite root tree whose nodes are labeled by formulas from an underlying language, and whose edges represent the above-mentioned arbitrary inferences. The proof structure may come with a function from top to lower nodes that count for the discharge of assumption. The unbound top nodes are the assumption of the proof structure, let's call them gamma, while the root of the tree is the conclusion of the proof structure, let's call it A. Then, since proof structure involves arbitrary inference, the reduction that in this approach we must use has to be arbitrary as well. So we do not have to deal with specific detours given by specific elimination rule, but we generalize the detour induced by any possible kind of inference in non-introduction form, relative, of course, to some chosen set of privileged premises. So we can define a reduction as an effective function phi defined on some set of proof structure D from assumption gamma to conclusion A, whose last inference is not, of course, an introduction rule, and such that first phi of D is a proof structure from gamma star, including gamma, to A. Second, phi is defined on any proof structures D star obtained from D by replacing elements of gamma with proof structures for them. 3. The image of any D star via phi is the same proof structure as the one we obtain by first applying phi to D and then doing on phi of D the replacement required to obtain D star. Once we have the notion of proof structure and the notion of reduction, we can then move to the notion of validity of proof structure. By saying validity of argument, by saying that validity of proof structure is relativized to a set of reduction J. Actually, as we have seen already in Dummett, the notion of validity in proof structure should also be relativized to what is normally called an atomic base. That is a set of atomic rules working as a kind of model, but I shall abstract from this. So we can say that D is valid relative to a set of reduction J if and only if 1. D has no undischarged assumptions. D is closed, and by applying the elements of J, it reduces either to a proof structure where only atomic inferences are used if the conclusion is atomic, or to a proof structure ending by introduction whose immediate substructure are valid relative to J if the conclusion of D is compound. Or D had a discharged and involves undischarged assumption, and for any D star obtained as above by replacing the unbound assumption of D by closed proof structure for them relative to an extension J star of J, it holds that T star is valid relative to J star. The extension of J is needed since the proof structure replacing the unbound assumption may contain new inferences which require new reductions. With all this material, we can come to the validity of inference. And we say that an inference R is valid relative to a set of reductions J if and only if, whenever R is appended to proof structure that are valid relative to some extension J star, what we obtain is a proof structure which is valid relative to J star. Just an observation. The inferential validity is not given by definability of reductions in virtue of which non-introduction inferences can be seen to somehow invert the introduction rules, either in the sense of not being weaker than them, or in the sense of unfolding some proof structure for the conclusion contained in proof structure for the premises. An inference is valid in a quite standard sense if it preserves the core notion of the semantic. That is, if it transmits validity of proof structures from the premises to the conclusion. In other words, inferential validity is defined in terms of global conditions of reducibility, introduction form of the proof structures which the inference does to. Of course, when one focuses on normalization theory for a specific natural deduction calculus, then inferential validity in this sense is the same as normalizability. So one might say that no gain is achieved by shifting the focus from local to global reducibility. But the situation changes as soon as one defines the validity predicate, not for derivation of specific calculus, but for proof structures with arbitrary inferences. And now I will give three different examples. The first one, contrary to what happens on other proof-theoretic traditions that I will discuss in a while, for an inference to be valid, it's not required that it be associated to just one reduction tailored on the given inference. Precisely because inferential validity does not depend on the local behavior of the inference, but on its global behavior relative to reducibility to introduction form, an inference might be valid, for example, relative to no reduction. And this is clearly the case that you see on the slide. So the inference from premises A and not A to any conclusion B, which is recklessly valid simply because closed valid proof structures for its premises cannot be found. If we assume, of course, that there can be no closed valid proof structure for the absurdity. Likewise, an inference might be valid relative to more than one reduction. And in fact, it might happen that only of such condition can some given inference be valid. Consider, for example, the inference from premises A implies B implies C to the conclusion A and B implies C. And take the reduction that you see displayed here. Yeah, the reduction you see displayed here, which essentially turns any application of the inference to a proof structure for its premises into a derivation of the rule in minimal logic. This reduction is necessary, but is not sufficient for proving the validity of the inference, because in its image, other non-introduction inferences occur, namely elimination of conjunction and elimination of implication. So we need reductions for this elimination too. Beware that a derivation in minimal logic is valid only in the presence of a sampless theorem, which in turn requires reduction for elimination of this logic. Because of this latter fact, and as a certain as the recent results of minimum and individualistic logic have shown, an inference might be valid without being harmonious, told relative to the introduction, but just because a suitable combination of reductions happen to reduce any application of the inference to the right introduction form. An example is the atomic split rule that you can see here, which can be proved to be valid relative to the reduction below. Observe the second reduction that is totally absurd. It takes a non-introduction and proof structure with conclusion Q1 or Q2, call it D, and add a fake inference step with conclusion Q1 between the premises of the last inference of D and the conclusion. This is in no way a justification of an inference, but it is a reduction in the SR sense, which, when combined with the first reduction, justifies globally the atomic speed rule. For the third example, let me mention an important paper of Peter Schroeder-Reister from 2006 called Validity Concepts in Proof-Theoretic Semantics. Schroeder-Reister, in fact, proves that in general, validity relative to a set of reductions J is neither sufficient nor necessary for normalizability relative to J. So the first are a proof structure might be valid relative to the set of reduction J, but not normalizable relative to J. To see this, consider any proof structure from false assumption which is not normalizable modulo J. Since the assumptions are false, the proof structure is rigorously valid relative to J. Now the other way around. So a proof structure might be not normalizable relative to J, might be normalizable relative to J, but not valid relative to J. Consider, for example, the closed proof structure below. We infer P from zero assumption as an axiom, we may say, and then we infer Q and P through an inference that belongs to star. Star is not an introduction rule, so for this proof structure to be valid relative to a set of reduction J, it must reduce by J to a proof structure ending by conjunction introduction rule. This will of course not happen relative to the empty set of reductions, since the latter will not trigger any reducibility sequence. For the same reason, however, the proof structure is normal relative to the empty set of reduction. Let's try to summarize a little bit which is the general framework for this approach. So the task in this tradition, from semantic to rule tradition, is not really explaining how some inferences give meaning in terms of some rigorous defined notion of harmony between introduction and elimination rules. The introduction are simply assumed to provide a full determination of meaning. The task is instead that of giving some proof-based criteria of validity. Reduction are just proof rewriting functions and lose their immediate justificatory value. So it's not a coincidence. So once the notion of valid proof structure is in place, we can define a notion of consequence by saying that A is a consequence of gamma if and only if there is a proof structure D and a set of reduction J such that D is valid relative to J. So it's not coincidence that in recent times, the SR tradition has developed an abstract approach where proof structures and reduction are left out, and where what matters is just the consequence relation, which is now defined not in terms of existence of a valid proof structure, but by direct induction on the complexity performance. So the adequacy of a set of elimination is not given by criteria of harmony. Indeed, it must be given in terms of a, we can say, external completeness result, to the effect that if an inference is valid in the sense described above, then the inference is derivable in the chosen logic. Just to summarize some typical problem that this type of approach is used to face, we can call the functional completeness of logic, identity of proofs, and application to various logic. For instance, applications to modal logic, linear logic, classical logic, ecumenical logic. And there are, however, some more specific issues too. For example, criteria of acceptability, especially relative to issue of completeness of identity proofs, relations with the Kerry-Howard isomorphism, with Martin-Love's type theory, and formulation of SR based on second calculus rather than on natural deduction. So once present this the first survey of the SR approach, let's move from rules to semantic approach. As I said at the beginning of the presentation, this approach takes Gentzen tenet literal. So the idea is that the introduction rule defines the meaning of the logical terms, and the elimination rule are justified by the same meaning, being consequence of the corresponding introduction rule. Thus, the notion of validity that results is analytical. Only on this slide, we focus for a while on the criteria imposed on introduction for being meaning conferring rules. This point is relatively underdeveloped in this tradition, at least if we compare it with the topic of the justification of elimination rules. But let's see just two examples two inference rules that have a controversial status. The first rule you see on the left introduces a conditional in the scope of disjunction, and so in subordinate position. So it was proposed by Leonardo to explain the meaning of classical condition, but as you can imagine, has a controversial status. The question is, does it count this inference rule as an introduction for condition or an introduction for disjunction? And then we can move to the second inference rule proposed by Reed as the proof-theoretic version of the Lawyer's paradox, defining a zero-array connective in terms of its negation. It's clear that this definition is circular in some way. However, as frequently observed by the adeptists, we seem to have no problem in grasping the Lawyer's sentence. So the question is, are introduction rules of this kind semantically acceptable? But now we can move to the main subject of this second tradition that concerns the justification of elimination rule. So the crucial point is, which elimination rules are justified by the meaning of the connective given by the corresponding introduction rule? Following part, Dummett proposes the criterion of harmony to be sure elimination rules that are not too strong in the sense that they produce only derivations justified by the meaning conferred to the connective of the corresponding introduction. Moreover, it proposed a dual criterion of stability to secure that elimination rules procedures all derivations justified by the meaning conferred to the connective by the rules. And you can see a lot of correspondence between what you have said on Michael Dummett. On the next slide, we will deepen the various proposals, but now we can see them in this table. So they are listed from the more extensional to the more intentional one. We start with separability and uniqueness, which are defined only in terms of derivability. Then we move to criteria based on inversion principle and deductive equilibrium, which still focus on derivability, but of formulas extracted from introduction and elimination rules, imposing some restrictions on which rules can be used to prove derivability, while the last two sets, so local, intrinsic, and general elimination, are the most intentional criteria, focusing on the structure of the derivations and on the specific form of the rules. But let's see them one by one. So the first one is the most extensional criteria. As you see, harmony is defined as separability, and in such a way it requires that any probable consequence has a proof involving only structural rules or the rules for logical operator present in the consequence. For instance, a system where the double negation elimination is required to prove a law that does not involve negation, for instance, the Bayes' law, is considered not separable. At the same time, we can define stability as uniqueness. So in this case too, by referring to Michael Dummett criteria of stability. And the idea proposed by Bellina is that uniqueness evaluates whether a set of rules fully characterize a logical term. So a connective is unique if given a second connective governed by identical rules, the two are logically equivalent. The rules for box operator in S4, for instance, fails this criterion because we can add two distinct modalities governed by the same rules without them being equivalent. We can then move to the inversion principle, harmony, and stability. And we start by a description of introduction and elimination rule. This proposal is for higher level rules with propositional quantification, but we will not focus on this topic right now. The important point is that from introduction and elimination rules for an arbitrary connecting, we extrapolate the sufficient condition for asserting formulas with that connecting as main operator and their consequences. Now, given this background, harmony and stability are defined in terms of derivability. Specifically, harmony is defined as a criterion of reduction, which states that it must be possible to derive every consequence of a connective from the sufficient condition used to introduce it, while stability is defined as a criterion for recovery, which requires that the consequences of a connective be sufficient to, in some sense, get the connective back, ensuring that elimination rules are powerful enough to recover the meaning defined by introduction rules. So now we can skip to another set of criteria: deductive equilibrium, harmony, and maximality. And this type of analysis is due to Neil Tennant, who provides a specific interpretation of harmony and stability called deductive equilibrium. Under this interpretation, a logical constant expresses the strongest possible proposition that can be inferred from its introduction rules, and the weakest that can serve as a measure, that can serve as a measure premises for its elimination rules. So the definition is focused on the strength of formulas, which is interpreted in connection with derivability. However, this approach uses intentional restriction on rules to exclude the effective connectives like tonk. As you can see on the slide, A tonk B is the strongest possible proposition that can be inferred from tonk introduction, that says that if something follows from A, then it follows from A tonk B as well. And the weakest that can serve as a major premises for elimination rule from tonk, that says that if something entails B, then it is entailed by from A tonk B. Maximality, stability for maximality, acts as the stability counterpart, requiring that given an introduction rule, the corresponding elimination rule must be the strongest possible one that remains in harmony. So, step by step, we are approaching the more intentional criteria. In this slide, we see the traditional interpretation of harmony and stability as availability of single steps of reduction and expansion. The criteria are, of course, also at the core of the other tradition. However, there is a difference. In this tradition, so from rules to semantic tradition, there is a tendency to require only the existence of a single local steps of reduction and expansion, as opposed to what happens in the from semantic to rules tradition, where the point is reducibility to canonical form. As a consequence, in this tradition, so in RS, it deals differently with paradoxical formulas that generate looping reduction, such as Ritz-Barrett and Bravitz's rule for structure. And then, now we can move to the general elimination harmony and completeness. General elimination harmony treats elimination rules as a function of their corresponding introduction rule. This approach, developed by Reed, Frances, and Dickoff, requires elimination rules to have a general structure that does not restrict to the form of the conclusion. So for every introduction rule, a corresponding general elimination rule is generated based on the ground of the introduction rule. We can see the example on the slide. We start with n introduction rules for an arbitrary connecting. This formulation is due to Giacinto Reed, and it's applied to higher level rules, but we can ignore this aspect and consider just theta as a simple formula. The function gives a set of general elimination rules in which each introduction rule contributes with a minor premises. We can notice that elimination rule discharge derivation. So in general, it's one step higher than the corresponding introduction rule. The approach to stability at this point is a little tricky, and we can note it here. So given these different ways of characterizing criteria for the relationship between introduction and elimination rule, we can move to a sort of summary of this second approach. So we can say that in from rules to semantic approach tradition, the aim is to explain how rules confer analytic meaning to logical terms. So this position that we can call semanticism posits that logical laws are analytic because they are justified by the meaning constitutive rules. Beyond standard natural deduction, this tradition explored also stronger formalizations, including bilateral system, so involving rules for both assertion and denial, hypersequent calculi, and multiple conclusion systems. While some authors pertaining to this tradition seek a single correct logic, so they take a monist position, others endorse pluralism, recognizing that multiple logics can be equally justified by different valid types of proof-theoretic balance. So just to conclude, some reflection on what is the value of the survey I have just presented. And we think that this survey is useful for two reasons. The first one concerned the proof-theoretic semantic field from inside and from outside. If we adopt the distinction that is often overlooked, we can avoid the objections which are addressed to only one of the traditions being referred also to the other, or depend on an overlapping of the two approaches. At the same time, keeping in mind this distinction permits to highlight similarities. For instance, the similarity that occurred between Travis' notion of analytically valid argument, where the inversion principle has more prominence and where one distinguishing between immediately valid inferences, and Reed's notion of argumental validity, defined as derivability based on primitive harmonic truth-preserving rules. Thank you.